Welcome to this Estyn podcast, where we will discuss a number of key successes and challenges in the apprenticeship provision. I'm Mark Evans, HMI, and I have the pleasure of being joined today by two guests, Bernie Tyler from the B Warble Consortium and Nathan Blackwell from ACT. Over the last 3 years, we've found that providers have put a significant amount of energy into professional learning, and they've resourced this professional learning by a range of training activities. Those activities may be across the organisation, or they may be individualised. What strategies have you identified for your staff, and how do you measure the impact of those strategies?
I think with regards to the investment, both financially and time, I think one of the main areas we've seen what's required development amongst practitioners is that wraparound care, that pastoral care that's been required over the last however many years. I think giving practitioners the tools to be able to deal with the wellbeing issues of learners that have come through has been a massive sort of insight for us at ACT. And I think what that's done is that's allowed to foster a relationship between the practitioners and the learners of that wraparound care, and that understanding that learners' needs are probably far greater than what they were many years ago, particularly when you think about those underlying kind of needs, softer skills that are required from learners prior to being ready for assessments. So I think we've seen a great sort of investment in that practitioner training to be able to recognise the wellbeing needs, to be able to signpost where that's required. I think that's been really important to us particularly.
Is there much difference with your own organisation, Bernie?
Not really. I think as Nathan said, I think the last 5 years have really steered us in that direction of focusing on wellbeing. Ultimately, to get a learner to their end goal, it's okay doing all the other support, but if they don't feel okay or their mental health is poor, they need that additional support. And what we wanted to do was not put assessors in a position where they had to come up with all the solutions, but again, as Nathan said, to look at signposting. So give them the sort of knowledge and all the resources they need, the companies they can go to, the charities that they can use then to say to this learner, you use this, you use that, and to take the emphasis off them, but give them the skills to be able to actually do the support. And in that, of course, then the outcomes come with it, don't they, really? If you support your learners, with every part of their learning, then everything else will come with it. So it is really, really important. So definitely our focus for at least the last 5 years. I think every conference we've had, I think every sort of teaching and learning event we have, there is always that well-being sort of sat in the background or part of it. And also for the assessors as well. At one of our conferences, we embedded things like, yoga and massage, all that sort of thing, so they could get some time out for themselves as well, because it is staff well-being as well as learners, isn't it?
Do you find that you initially start with the whole organisation training, so all staff access training, but then how do you identify the individual needs of assessors or staff to make sure they have got the skills to support learners effectively? Because as you say, that the types of needs that learners are presenting with now are wide and varied.
Yeah, I think what's really important is kind of that self-evaluation within the organisation. I think, like you said, we know using wellbeing as an example or the provision for ALN as another example, where we know that those issues exist, and as a company there needs to be an approach to tackle that. But I think within the delivery departments within ACT, that strong, robust self-evaluation process allows those practitioners to be able to take part in that evaluation, because I think having that continuous improvement culture within the business allows assessors, tutors, practitioners to be able to identify where their needs are and linking those needs to then the needs of the learners. So I think for us, that robust, inclusive self-evaluation process throughout the company has really allowed practitioners to kind of put their hands up and say, I need a little bit more in my toolkit to be able to give the learners that extra quality of delivery, or that extra bit of pastoral care, that wrap around to get the learners to benefit and really sort of enhance their experience within the programmes.
You touched on a very interesting point there, Nathan, and we identified this in our annual report. The number of ALN learners, which is significantly increased post the pandemic. With your ALN learners, do you find that those learners are identified for individual need when they join the programme, or is it something that tends to come to the fore as they go through their training?
I think it's a really interesting topic. I think there's a real mixed bag in terms of you will have learners that will come onto the programme and are confident to talk about their needs as a learner. And I think what happens then is that as you develop through the programme, that element of trust and that relationship and rapport that builds with the tutor, the assessors, the practitioners, it then sort of enhances the knowledge for the practitioner of the need that's actually required. And I think that develops over time, I think, with the relationship. But I think we do see majority of our learners will come with that sort of trust that they can disclose what their needs are, and then they're not really afraid to ask for that additional help. So yeah, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag, but I think trust is something that definitely develops over time, and that helps with that process.
And are we finding that employers are making those reasonable adaptations and modifications to support learners who have an ALN?
I think employers find it quite tricky, don't they? And quite often, I mean, a learner doesn't have to disclose to the employer that they have ALN, they disclose to us if they wish to, but they don't then necessarily share that wider. So sometimes it's difficult for the employer. I think they do their best, but they need to have all the information to enable them to do that, and we need to have that permission to share it. So it depends.
So a significant upskilling job for many of your staff, especially the assessors, in terms of the identification and that discrete support of ALN. Has there been a need to recruit specialist staff in the organisation?
Yeah, I think for us, in terms of that, the ALN Go role, I think in terms of having that clear structure within that ALN provision has been really important. I think the use of support staff definitely within that provision to be able to recognise at the point of referral as well, I think is important in terms of how those individual learning plans are constructed and how they're constructed on the needs of the learners, because the needs can vary quite a lot. And I think giving tutors and learners the tools to be able to self-manage them is important, but having that support staff and that structure in the background for us as a provider really helps us come together to reflect constantly on the practices we used and the provision that we have to give the learners the best kind of opportunities. But I think what's also important, coming back to talking about employers, I think within the sort of professional learning, there's been a lot of work to be done to understand the needs of the industry. And I think where that has happened, there's been that linking, and where we understand the needs of the industry, that also allows us then to tailor the provision, not just for learners with ALN, but also in general. So I think that relationship with the employers and understanding that need within the industry also helps as well.
So thank you very much for that. That leads me on now to when we look at a number of programmes, we clearly see that learner attainment rates have increased post the pandemic. However, there still remains underachievement in a few learning areas. And if we look at higher apprenticeship rates, that tends to be an area where the attainment rates are not significantly improving. Have you found that within your own organisations? And what do you think are the reasons for that under-attainment in specific learning areas?
Yeah, we definitely seen that. It's been ongoing. It's been an ongoing thing for us, I think, for the last sort of 3 or 4 years in terms of higher apprenticeship achievement rates. And they did go up slightly last year, and they are above the national comparator, but still a challenge for us. I think one of the things for us specifically is the sectors in which we deliver. We deliver in health and social care, in construction, in management. And I think it's the nature of the learner that goes into that programme. I mean, they've probably got quite high-level jobs. They've already got a lot of responsibilities, and maybe sometimes they don't fully understand the commitment they need to put into an apprenticeship to achieve it. And I think when their job takes over, then the learning obviously slips back, and then they achieve late or they don't achieve at all. So I think it's come down really for us to how we induct the learners and ensure they know what they will be getting when they come on the programme. I think another issue in health and social care has been the job role, that sometimes the job role doesn't suit the requirements of the higher apprenticeships. That's mismatch between the content of the framework and the job that the learner does. quite often you lose the ability to practice your vocational skills because it's very concentrated on leadership. So it's that balance in what the framework contains.
Yeah, I think we share some of those points that Bernie's made in terms of definitely where you have the hierarchy within higher apprenticeships where they do, in lots of occasions, have more demanding jobs. There is that constraint on time. I think one of the other things that we've seen as well with higher apprenticeships is whilst there's a good match in terms of those day-to-day job roles they have and them meeting the occupational standards, that jump sometimes in the academical requirements of the frameworks is sometimes too great a jump, and that can sometimes lead to disengagement as well. Even with the pre-work that goes, I think where you have those high-pressure job roles in terms of time constraints, sometimes even with the best will, that jump can be slightly too much sometimes as well. And I think for us as well, in terms of what we're talking about with higher apprenticeships, in some sectors, there's not as clear progression pathways for that higher apprenticeship sometimes. So in some sectors, the want or the desire to develop the skills within that workforce is there, but sometimes learners then can't see later on down the road that clear progression within their current employment, and that can sometimes be disengaging for them. And I think, we do see that in small numbers, but I think it is a contributing factor.
So do you think maybe there's a need for strengthened advice and guidance to make sure that learners, employers have a greater awareness of the requirements of the programme and the commitments that the learner needs to make to achieve?
Absolutely. And I think one of the things Bernie touched upon was the induction, the robust induction. And I think that's something that as we are coming sort of through the last cycle, we've started to focus quite a lot of attention on in terms of that induction, that onboarding, and that being inclusive of both learners and employers to understand that need for off-the-job hours, for the other aspects of the framework that take time, not just the occupational sort of proving of that they can do these tasks day in, day out. So I definitely think there has been a shift in focus with the induction, talking to employers, and working with employers as well, and those key employers to understand how the constraints of kind of the sector are having on them as employers and on the learners, and working together to kind of try and find those resolutions. I think that's something that's improved over the last number of years. I think that's a very important point that you make there, Nathan, because I think when you look at a very few learning areas, such as social care that you mentioned, it's quite often the case that those learners will not naturally get off-the-job activities to undertake teaching, training or assessment away from their workplace. And quite often that's by choice or in negotiation with the employer. But I think that does put added pressure on the learner to make sure all their work is completed in their own time. Do you think the challenge remains, Bernie, to make sure that employers are fully aware of their contribution and there's the support that they can give to their learners? Yeah, definitely. I think educating employers is one of the most important things we should be doing, and something that we're, as an organisation and as a consortium, looking at quite keenly. Obviously, people do it well, but we can always do it better. It's just making sure you've got that arrangement at the beginning, that tripartite arrangement where everybody is fully aware of the commitments of an apprenticeship, especially at a higher level. I mean, it's an academic level. Those learners will need time and space to write the assignments, to do the work, to do the research, and it's making sure everyone is well aware of that from the outset. And do you also think that there's a need maybe to be more selective in terms of the learners who do undertake higher apprenticeships? Because as you've clearly stated, there's often lots of challenges for the learner, for the employer, and therefore for your assessors. And do you also think that there's a need maybe to be more selective in terms of the learners who do undertake higher apprenticeships? Because as you've clearly stated, there's often lots of challenges for the learner, for the employer, and therefore for your assessors. Do you think maybe we need to be more advisory in terms of learners need to do developmental work, maybe in study skills, before they actually progress to undertaking the full apprenticeship?
Yeah, possibly. And I also think we have to be really honest as providers and as organisations who recruit apprenticeships. Is that the right programme for that particular learner at that point? I mean, if they're progressing, I think they probably already have the knowledge of what apprenticeship is, so they know what they're going into. But if you're going straight into a higher apprenticeship, is that absolutely the right thing for all people? Is it the right thing for the learner? Is it the right thing for the employer and the business? So I think it's really, really important to have that discussion and be really honest about what other options there might be before you embark on something that's going to take over maybe 2-3 years of your time and effort.
And the change in nature of some qualifications, namely health and social care, construction, they've changed the content and the assessment methodology. However, that is being changed as we currently speak. That also often makes it more difficult for learners who may not enter with those prerequisite skills to make the progress we would have hoped.
Yeah, I think that touching upon, I think one of the things we have been doing well is, and I think it is something that does need improvement, but it has definitely shifted over the last 3 to 5 years, is where we talk about that selection process for qualifications is actually giving the employers and the learners the power and the knowledge to be able to carry out that selection process prior to them even entering kind of the establishments. So I think that recruitment and selection is getting better based on the knowledge and the discussions that's happening between providers and employers, particularly where they're larger employers and they've got recruitment teams and they've got a central point of contact, and that relationship has really developed over time. So I think that comes back again to those relationships and how hard providers are working to establish that, so that those learners and the prerequisites are being thought of before passing them over to us.
So to really make sure that we continue in terms of that triangulation of the learner, the employer being central with the assessor, to make sure that training is not only fully supported, but the learner reaches their full potential. That leads me on to something that we're saying continuously, especially post the pandemic, is learners' rates in terms of how long they take to complete their apprenticeships, those timely completion rates. And we've found that learners are consistently taking longer to achieve their apprenticeship frameworks than they did previously. Now, in our annual report, we will say that a significant number take too long to complete. So what we're finding is learners will have a scheduled end date, but a significant amount is taking a substantial amount of time beyond that end date to achieve. Now, they may eventually achieve and attain that full framework, but what we're really interested in is the reasons why they're taking longer, and the amount who take longer is still currently high, although it is decreasing. What do you think are the main reasons for your organisations that this cohort of learners are taking that's much longer than expected?
I think for us, there's a number of different reasons, and I think some of them link back to the previous discussion point around higher apprenticeships. But I think when we're touching upon post-COVID over the last number of years, I think what we found is and it's probably a reason why, in terms of professional learning, there's been that massive emphasis on the well-being. So I think that in terms of learners have been presenting with, in some cases, those lower, softer skills in terms of that confidence and the ability to be ready for assessment. And I think there's a lot of pre-work that's having to be done by practitioners, and they are now becoming practitioners, more rounded in terms of the amount of work they have to do with learners in terms of building that relationship, building that confidence, in order for them to be comfortable with the assessments that will come as part of these frameworks. So I think there's a large amount of pre-work that has to be done that maybe wasn't so much the case in previous years, is part of a reason, if in terms of what we are seeing, Mark. And I think that also sometimes then links to the complexity of some of the framework components, some of the external kind of components, the examinations that are assessed. I think, again, the time that it takes to get learners ready for them, and then kind of in some cases being able to find examination slots, or where there potentially are resets, the financial implications, or the time that's then required to get learners ready. I think all of these things then add up to extended periods on the programme.
Just following on from that, Nathan, so would you say that the time that's allocated for learners to complete an apprenticeship is too little?
I think in terms of some of the complexities we see with the learners, I would say that it's not feasible in all cases in terms of the amount of work that's needed. I think what we've seen is we've seen providers within the sector where their main objective and their main priority is to successfully complete the learners at all costs. And I think where you have learners that are presenting as sort of uncomfortable, unconfident, the main priority is to make sure that they are comfortable with that process, and it's a very seamless process. So for us, that means that commitment is there, regardless of then what that end date is. So yeah, in some cases it doesn't help that they need all this pre-work.
Thank you, Nathan. Really?
I think for us, yeah, well, it's exactly the same. Obviously, we have the same issues as yourself, very similar. But I think obviously we have to go. I was looking this morning to look at what timely completion rates were like prior to COVID. I think, were they really that much better? And they were significantly better. And actually what was so good then we didn't even think was acceptable. So it's quite interesting how we now accept something that's less. But I think COVID had a big impact, especially in terms of particular sectors where new qualifications came in at the same time as obviously we were in lockdown. And then coming out of that, I think we had massive issues, didn't we, in terms of catching up and supporting those learners through a really difficult period, just in terms of their your well-being, like you said, and then obviously qualifications in different sectors that we really had challenges with. So I think that slowed us up significantly, and that has improved. But then we've had other qualification changes in other sectors where for example, we've lost a foundation apprenticeship in one sector completely. So that level 2 has gone. So you've got learners coming on to a level 3. Again, that goes back to what we were talking about earlier about that induction and that readiness. And then they're on to programs that can be 3 or 4 years long. Well, these young people could be maybe 16, 17. That's a really big undertaking to take on a program of that length at that time. And I think they get quite daunted by it. And it takes them even longer to complete, or they struggle with the components of it because there was never no foundation level prior to that. So yeah, I guess I'm focusing more on the different sectors, but I do think, and then in other sectors, timely is not an issue. Learners do really well, they complete on time. So it is, for us, very much focused in different areas and helping those learners in those areas to achieve.
So across your own organisations, it's clearly defined that there's a number of sectors what perform well, learners generally complete within their set timeframes, and then there's other sectors, learning areas, where learners generally take longer.
Yeah, and I think also it comes down to what the job is. So depending on what your apprenticeship is in, you may find it more difficult to achieve on time because of the pressure of your role. I mean, if you're working in the NHS, I guess that's very demanding, and is there time to complete all your work and therefore you go over? So, yeah, it's difficult to manage.
Across your own organisations, what tends to be the most successful learning areas for timely completions?
I'd say hair and beauty. We seem to be about engineering.
Yeah.
Much more successful.
Where those practical elements are day in, day out in terms of, I would say that's the case with us, I think. And I would also just to kind of go back onto the timely completions. I think the other consideration is with where you have programs that have longer durations, there is also a higher risk of interference.
Yeah.
Potentially changes in job roles, personal circumstances that can also be factored in sometimes as well. And we maybe don't consider that as a trend, but it's definitely the potential for interference over those longer durations can also sometimes be there.
And that may be, Nathan, learners moving on to a different employer, a different job role, absolutely. Even moving out the sector?
Yes, yeah, and I think that is sometimes the case, particularly when we go back and talk about where they recognise that there may not be a clear progression pathway, then that might be something that can also be an issue, but I think definitely where they potentially may have these interferences that can then maybe sort of extend and reduce what they can do from a time capacity. Definitely.
Thank you. We spoke about those learning areas, what are successful. I think you know the next question. It's what are the main learning areas where learners generally take longer to achieve?
Okay, for us, it would be health and social care and construction are our two main ones where, we definitely have issues. Health and social care has improved significantly from where it was. I think that's because obviously the sector's coming out of a really difficult period and picking back up, and the learners are, we've given them the tools to be resilient, and hopefully, time will tell with that. Construction, the qualification is much newer. We've lost the foundation level. Learners are coming straight into a level 3, which can be challenging in itself. Qualifications are long. And there's different elements of those that we're not used to. Endpoint assessment, it's proved challenging, professional discussions. There's lots of hurdles in it that I think are allowing the learner to, get stuck in a rut a little bit, maybe struggle to get through the qualification. And I think as well for the assessors, it's when things are new, you're working through it too, aren't you? And trying to pace it at the right level and guide the learners and set targets. But then some things are out of your control with the discussions and the assessment. So I think it's like a perfect storm, really, all sorts of things coming together that delay that progress of the learning.
Does it mean, Bernie, that with these new qualifications, your assessors need to develop not only their knowledge of the new qualifications, but different skills to enable learners to progress?
Absolutely. I think, if you think of sectors like engineering, engineering we don't have so many issues with, but in engineering construction, with all the new green skills and all the different things they now have to learn, it's an ongoing process of just trying to keep up with technology and industry, isn't it? Also, like AI is becoming a big thing in what we do. So it is assessors are busy people. They've got so many things to do. They've got to look after their caseload, encourage their learners, get them finished, and keep themselves up to date.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more. I think over a number of years, the role of the assessor is dramatically improved and increased. And I think their professional skill set is most certainly improved over the years, and the level of support that they give learners in many different ways, from that support in terms of assessment or even delivery to that pastoral support. But I do think that when it works well, it works particularly well, and it's a very strong relationship between assessor and learner, which does foster learning and therefore improvement. Following on, something we've also found, and I think it links very nicely with what we've just been saying, it is learners' resilience and their need for constant assessor support. And what we've been finding is that, once again, post-COVID, is that learners at level 3 and above do not always take responsibility for their learning in their programme as much as they did previously. And they're highly reliant on their assessors to guide them and maybe lead them too much in a number of occasions. And that means in many ways that your assessors are often making more visits to the workplace, they're working longer hours to support learners, they're developing different materials to support learners, and they're often there spending an enhanced amount of time with learners than they're often programmed for or they did previously.
Oh, that's a tricky one, isn't it?
Yeah, I think for us, it comes back to, and we've talked a couple of times about induction. I think setting the scene, it has become more of a real priority in terms of that beginning, those initial conversations with the learners, for them to understand, their input to the programme. It is their programme and the responsibilities that they hold with their programme. I think two particular areas for us at ACT is the way we've looked to develop a real understanding of coaching and mentoring in terms of giving our learners, our practitioners, that toolkit to be able to foster a relationship that is based around empowering the learner to be independent, with the use of e-learning platforms as well, and the ownership that comes with being involved in an e-learning platform, where learners have that autonomy to look at their progress, to look at how the standards are mapping into their day-to-day, and that continual sort of knowledge around their program. But I think definitely coaching and mentoring, the scaffolding learning of that high dependency at the beginning, but that withdrawal through the program as those skills and that confidence is developed through the culture of learning with ACT.
Yeah, it just keeps going back to induction, doesn't it, really? And setting the scene out from the outset, making sure everyone knows what's expected of them and are ready to sort of take on an apprenticeship. And again, back to the well-being, because resilience comes from having the support in the background to help you achieve something, doesn't it? So you can't make a learner resilient unless they have everything in place to do that. You can't become resilient on your own. It's down to your, home life, your employer and all those things around you, because that gives you that confidence to be resilient, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think case studies as well in terms of recognising learner awards and learner achievements and seeing how those learners have developed those skills and that independence and the link that it has to the impact in the workplace, and learners seeing these real examples of how their skills of individuals have been developed helps them understand how those skills can benefit them and their employer, and it does increase the engagement and the participation in terms of what we see as well.
Do you think that assessors on occasion may be resistant to actually setting our targets for achievement with their learners? Because I think we talk about individual learning plans, and what we often see is those targets not being individual. They're very much generic for that cohort of learners. And on occasion, we speak to assessors, and assessors are very wary that they do not want to overburden their learners, and that they state examples of learner well-being. And what we're seeing in those instances is that assessments then drift. And the target dates are moved back. And that then means that those assessments tend to block up at the end of the programme and puts extra pressure on your assessors to do those visits more regularly. So I think I thoroughly agree with you, Nathan. It's about that induction in setting the scene. But do you think that there is that resistance to setting the sharp, hard, challenging targets now that we once saw pre-COVID being the norm?
It's striking a balance, isn't it? It's getting that balance between working with your learner to give them a target that is stretching and challenging, but also probably looking at everything else that's around that learner and can they manage that? And maybe sometimes we do take a maybe slightly softer approach than need be, but I think it's what we've developed. We've delivered training, haven't we, to our assessors to look for all these things and be supportive, and for that to be the most important thing. And probably within that, perhaps we've taken away that sharpness that could be there. It's finding a balance and getting that right. And maybe sometimes we don't do it so well. But we know who our assessors are that struggle with that. I'm sure you're the same. We can track what people are doing. We audit reviews to see what sort of things are being talked about. So we know where support can be given. And I think it's about coming together to give that support and looking at best practice and sharing it. Who does it really, really well? And their learners achieve on time. What do they do that's different? And just looking at that.
I think you're absolutely right there, Bernie. Is that balance, isn't it? And we're talking about individual learners and meeting their individual needs, all within that set time frame that you get to deliver the program. And I think that is a hard thing to do, is to get that balance. So I think it is about that assessor relationship with their learner, to know their learners well and what they can do to achieve. Do you think that Essential Skills Wales qualifications means that learners may take longer to achieve? Is there any pinch points with ESWs? Or do you find now, as a sector and as two organisations, you deliver ESWs and it's not preventing learners achieving on time?
I think for us, it's very much depending on the learner's circumstances. I think we talk about the learner being the centre of everything we do in terms of assessment. And in terms of those expectations, learners understand the framework requirements, but I think there will naturally be elements where learners are genuinely fearful of some of the qualifications in terms of, and that could be because of their history, in terms of that literacy, that numeracy, and in some cases they are barriers to individual. And throughout with the best provision that we have, sometimes those barriers are too far-reaching for learners to see past. So there are learners, regardless of the scale, that will see ESWs as a barrier to frameworks. And I think it's important that then we look at how you can almost, in some cases, work with learners in terms of the confidence levels, again, coming back to confidence. And I think that confidence comes from the rapport and the understanding of the background of the learner and really what their challenges are. And I think, again, coming back to timely, that's sometimes what takes time. It takes time to understand your learners, to build that relationship and to help them. But that is a barrier for some learners still, absolutely, from what we've seen.
Thank you, Nathan.
Also, I think sometimes the controlled tests and that exam feel of an environment. You go into an apprenticeship, don't you? Because maybe that you didn't like exams at school, so you're thinking something more vocational. I won't have to do those sort of things. And then they come straight into an apprenticeship and here we are, we're back to the thing that you didn't want to do in the first place. So I think it can be a real barrier, can't it, for some learners? Yeah. They can get really anxious and find it really difficult to complete. And obviously they can become unsuccessful in their framework, which is a shame. Obviously we have dispensations, don't we, for some learners in some instances. But yeah, I definitely think it's maybe not what everyone expects. So again, back to making sure you sell the components honestly and accurately from the outset.
How do you actually sell ESWs to your learners? Because I think I recognise everything that you're saying. Learners clearly say to us, it's bordering back on their experience at school, which may be negative with especially maths, possibly English, and they're going into a post-16 apprenticeship environment, and they're often replicating that experience. So what strategies do you use to actually inform learners of the benefits of developing their literacy and numeracy?
I think it is really difficult, and I think it does vary based on subject areas. I think honesty and transparency at the beginning, again, to understand that they are mandatory components in most cases. I think what particularly works well is that sector standardisation, and I think working with external organisations, external agencies, and I think we're all part of subcontracting arrangements where we have a wealth of experience and expertise across sectors, and I think standardisation has got a lot better in terms of sharing experiences and sharing resources, and I think that's kind of where we've got to, where we are trying to split those sector standardizations to understand how you can build those skills, those communication, literacy, numeracy skills, digital literacy into those sectors seamlessly as possible. But that takes a lot of people around the table to do that. That just doesn't happen overnight, definitely for us.
Also, I think if a learner has had their initial assessment and they need to do those essential skills because they don't have any the GCs at the right level, I mean, ultimately it's about selling those skills as things you need to be employable. I mean, you need to be able, in certain sectors, don't you, to be able to be good with numbers, and you need to be able to communicate, you need to be able to write, you need to be able to spell. And I think they are, in many instances, there are lost skills, aren't they? And whilst learners may not see it important, they may, as they progress in their roles, see how important it is that you can do those things and that you are good at it. I think sometimes we sort of forget how important they are.
Absolutely. Do you think the ESWs actually prevent learners achieving their full apprenticeship framework? I.e., do you come across learners who just do not to complete the ESWs, so therefore they may have completed all the other aspects of the framework, but that element's outstanding, so therefore it's not a full achievement? Yeah, we do. And I guess obviously for us, we want the framework achievement, we want learners to achieve everything, but there are instances out there, and once that learner's got that vocational qualification,
then they can practice in that role they want to do, and it becomes less important to them to achieve all aspects of the frameworks, which is disappointing. But that is the way of the world and the way of employment, in that they don't see the necessity of getting that last little bit as much as we want them to get it. So yeah, there are learners that will fail frameworks because they haven't completed essential skills, unfortunately.
I think what we've got a lot better of as a sector is not to end load. And I think that discussion around tackling those literacy, numeracy, digital literacy sort of areas from the point of initial assessment has got a lot better, where we've kind of learnt it from years gone by, where we've got stung of frameworks not being completed because that is the last task. You've put it off, and then, right, okay, we've got to do this bit that we didn't want to talk about at the beginning. But I think but I think that comes down to honesty, transparency, induction in terms of explaining how the delivery of that framework is going to take place and how those literacy, numeracy is going to be done at the beginning and embedded where it can be. I think it's a really important point you made in terms of, in some sectors, it embeds a lot more easily than others. And I think where you can do that is a win. But I think being open and honest at the beginning and not end loading is one of the big keys we've benefited from over the last number of years. Yeah,
the point you raised there, Nathan, about the end loading, that's something that we recognised some time back with our engagement with the sector. It is that where it's end loaded, as Bernie said, learners often achieve the other elements of the framework, the bits what excites them and they're motivated by, and then they would just move on or leave without the ESWs. So I think generally as a sector, ESWs delivered far earlier in the programme, if not up front. But I think if we're still getting to the end and we've got learners not achieved the ESWs, I think that is something that maybe we do need to consider strategies, as you are doing within, to try and stop that. You also made point there, Nathan, about contextualising and embedded in ESWs. And I think where we see that across provision, it worked particularly well where the ESW is very much contextualised to that individual learning area. Learners see the clear relevance of it. I think it's where they don't always see the relevance, it's where it's very abstract and it's not associated with their particular learning area. But again, as you both said, you work with a large number of partners across your organisations, and to get that standardisation and consistency, you need a lot of people in a room, and that is a large piece of work to make sure that takes place. Would you say that contextualised work is generally available across the raft of learning areas?
No. It's for some sectors, and I say it's variable. I think we had some quite good resources come out yesterday for health and social care I've seen, but that isn't necessarily in all sectors. So yeah, I say it's variable.
Yeah, it's very much a lottery what learning area you work within. So thank you very much for that. Looking back, our apprenticeships have evolved, especially over the last 3-year inspection cycle. What would you say has been the key successes for your organisations over the last 3 years?
I think there's a number of things that come to mind, but I think one of the things for us, particularly thinking back and linking it back to professional learning, is the effective use of questioning in terms of how that's been developed. I think the amount of work that takes in terms of, we've talked about being able to involve partner organisations, but I think that effective use of questioning, it really does kind of foster that continuous professional development between practitioners. I think it also helps us to identify a lot more easily and earlier on the learners' needs, where their starting points are. And I think it also gives practitioners the toolkit to be able to effectively assess and teach to different levels of learners, whether that's learners with higher order thinking skills or that differentiated approach. And I think by doing that, I think we've been able to be a lot more inclusive in our delivery. And I think that's something that we're particularly proud of in terms of within our organisation.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd agree. On a different sort of theme, I think the digital platforms, I think maybe, again, sort of like 5 years ago, we were forced into using digital things that we probably weren't that comfortable with before, but I think it's transformed the way that we deliver apprenticeships, the way that learners engage with us and with their assessors. So even with wellbeing, we have part of our digital platform allows them to sort of say how they're feeling, allows us to monitor that, to pick it up, to provide support. And also from a management perspective, I mean, the amount of information and data we've got in terms of what's going on and where, being able to identify like a learner that's not happy or an employer that's not happy, to be able to jump on that, solve the situation and maybe keep the learner and employer both on track. I think, it's revolutionised apprenticeships. If you go back 6 years, we had nothing, just bits of paper. Now we don't have any paper at all.
A paperless organisation. I think it's interesting when you speak about digital platforms, because a lot of what you said there, it is maybe catching up with learners by a range of different remote means, and also that management of the programme. And it's just quite interesting for me because we went from the situation where there was an awful lot of online learning, and that worked for that period of COVID and then post-COVID. But generally, the mass of learners that we speak to generally prefer the face-to-face activity. Obviously, with remote learning where it suits and by agreement. But I think the sector has learnt many lessons, and it's about that flexibility, that the one size doesn't fit all, to be flexible for learners, but also to use those management systems more effectively and use those range of resources, what are available. I think one of those resources for me, and they vary across organisations, it is a far more strengthening of management systems to inform yourselves of learners who are at risk of making slower progress or dropping out. There's been a much sharper focus on those type of systems. Is it something your own organisations you have strengthened, developed further as a result of where we are in the current period of time?
Absolutely. I think our systems are developing constantly. I think the more we have, the more we want, the more information we've got, the more we need. I think what the trick is using it in the best way. But definitely. We have so many different mechanisms that tell us how a learner's doing. So we've got a learner voice. So if one negative comment will flag that learner, we know who they are, we can go and find out what's going on. We can look at how they're progressing in their qualification. Again, if they start slipping, we can see that. Even from in our position, we can see that, can't we? In any of the subcontractors. If they haven't had reviews, we can see that. So there's so many different aspects that we can home in on that allow us to sort of manage that individual learning programme, really. It can be at provider level, learner level, employer level. We've got so much at our fingertips. I think we are in a position to be delivering the best we can, really.
Yeah, and I think what's really important is with these e-learning platforms is that now we've given the learners the tools to be able to recognise their own progress. So the way in which learners are using their e-portfolio platforms is that they can recognise when they're behind progress. And so that ownership is almost flipped, not on the practitioners telling the learners you're behind, but the learners actually get into a stage where they're recognising that there's that shift, and then that develops those natural conversations that are a lot easier in terms of learners, because they have that ability to continually review their progress. They can see where it is that they can pick up time. And I think it's like you said, Mark, it's that blended approach. You always need that face-to-face contact, that personalised approach. But I think the fact that learners now have at their fingertips these systems and these tools to be able to recognise where they are, where they're going, target setting, helping them push forward has been a massive, massive benefit over the last number of years.
I think what's also been strengthened as well, it is once at-risk learners have been identified, those interventions So you've got a far wider range of interventions available than you had previously. And again, they do tend to vary very much from in-course vocational type intervention and support to those wide-ranging pastoral care support with a range of in-house support or indeed external services where required. I think that has been strengthened across your organisations. What I'd like now to go on to is that Estyn undertakes a wide range of engagement activity with a sector, and that interaction takes place over time. And over the last few years, we've been changing the way that we interact. What's worked well for yourselves in terms of that interaction?
I think it was, for me, it'd be the publication of the Ready Already. I quite like I think for us that was a really useful tool to give sort of partners and assessors that confidence that you don't have to be doing anything different when Estyn come to see us. You just need to be doing what you're doing and to be doing it well, and you should be doing it well because we're constantly looking at how we're doing, we're self-evaluating, we're writing our QDPs, we know what we need to develop, what we need to action, and we're doing all those things. So I think it's given us lots of confidence to be ready for yourselves, and confidence in our self-evaluation that when you do come, that you see what we've identified as an issue, not anything new. I think that's how I like to see it. Yeah, that you see our strengths, but what you identify as maybe needs work, we already know about it. So no surprises. And I think you've given us the tools to do that and the confidence to do it.
Thank you, Bernie.
Yeah, I think, like you said, it's also about that accountability, but that professional dialogue and that shift in professional dialogue, I think it maps quite closely to, like you said, the self-evaluation. I think there is that real recognition that from Estyn through the processes, the inspection and the monitoring visits, that the providers are correctly identifying those areas and those areas that are known nationally, that everyone knows about. But I think there's been a much sharper focus on the recognition within the quality development plans in terms of really understanding and recognising how partners, providers, the tools that they're using to target and to inform improvement. And I think that professional dialogue has gone a long way to sharpen our focus that the actions we're doing are having an impact, and they are impactful to learners directly.
Thank you. I hope you've found the conversation interesting and thought-provoking. I'd sincerely like to thank my guests today for their insightful comments and the time they've taken to join me. This podcast is one of a series available on the Estyn website. Please look out for further releases.